afternoon or good evening, depending on where you might be. My name is Kevin Michael Case, and this is the KMG show for Tuesday, May the 4th, 2021. I wanted to start off with a important new development in the trial of Derek Chauvin, who, of course, is the former Minneapolis police officer whose arrest of George Floyd led to his death last year. This is from the Daily Mail. Questions have been raised about the impartiality of one of the 12 jurors who convicted Derek Chauvin of murder after it was revealed he attended a rally last summer where George Floyd's relatives addressed the crowd. A photo posted on social media shows Brandon Mitchell attending an August the 28th event in Washington, D.C. to commemorate Martin Luther King Jr.'s I Have a Dream speech during the 1963 March on Washington. It shows Mitchell, a high school basketball coach, standing with two other men and wearing a t-shirt with a picture of King and the words, "Get your knee off our necks" and BLM. He is also wearing a baseball cap printed with Black Lives Matter. Mitchell has admitted the photo is of him from that date, but he defended attending the rally, claiming it was not explicitly a protest against police or a commemoration for George Floyd. This is despite the fact that Floyd's brother and sister, Philonise and Bridget Floyd, and relatives of other African Americans who have been shot by police addressed the crowd that day. Mitchell said he answered no to two questions about demonstrations on the questionnaire sent out before jury selection. Experts say the revelation could be grounds for the cops' appeal. Mitchell and Chauvin's attorney, Eric Nelson, have not returned messages from the Daily Mail. Mitchell, 31, acknowledged being at the event and that his uncle posted the photo, but said he doesn't recall wearing or owning the shirt. Mitchell was one of 12 jurors who convicted Chauvin of second and third-degree murder and second-degree manslaughter. And here's a list from the Mail of news sites which didn't cover jurors' attendance at protest: ABC News, the New York Daily News, CNN, the New York Times, and NBC News. Mitchell was one of 12 jurors who convicted Chauvin. He was the first to go public. Spoke to several media outlets last week, including the Associated Press. "I'd never been to D.C., Mitchell said of his reasons for attending the event. "The opportunity to go to D.C., the opportunity to be around thousands and thousands of Black people. I just thought it was a good opportunity to be part of something." Mike Brandt, a Minneapolis defense attorney not involved in the case, told the AP the revelation alone wasn't nearly enough to overturn Chauvin's conviction, but it could be combined with other issues: the announcement of a massive civil settlement to Floyd's family during jury selection, the shooting of Dante Wright, the judge's refusal to move the trial in an appeal to say Chauvin was denied a fair trial. One newspaper that did cover this story, unlike the New York Times, is the Washington Post. Its headline, "A photo of Chauvin juror wearing BLM t-shirt at march raises questions of impartiality, experts say." Well, I would certainly think so. As part of the jury selection, the Post writes, the candidates were required to fill out a 14-page questionnaire asking about a wide range of topics, including race and policing, as well as education levels, professional experience, and hobbies in order to gain in-depth knowledge about the candidates. It also asked prospective jurors about information they had on Floyd, their opinions on the BLM movement, and more specifically, if they had attended protests or demonstrations against police brutality. According to the Star Tribune, Mitchell said he had responded no to a question asking if he or anyone close to him had ever participated in protests over police use of force or police brutality. Jury consultant Alan Turkheimer said it is likely that Chauvin's defense attorney, Eric J. Nelson, will use this information to push for an appeal, but argued that the photo itself would not be enough to dismiss the conviction. Turkheimer added, however, that Mitchell's alleged denial that he was involved in any protests could prompt Judge Peter Cahill to bring Mitchell in for further questioning to assess whether he was untruthful or worse, if he had an agenda or a predetermined verdict in mind. Turkheimer said that could change the outcome of things. If there is anything that makes him seem that he was not forthcoming, it would be an avenue for the judge to reconsider the case. Turkheimer also underlined the complexity of the jury selection process and assessment of objective neutrality, adding it is possible that the juror did not see a connection between the march and the case. Really? Well, then I think if that were the case, that he should have been considered too stupid to serve on a jury. William Jacobson writes at Legal Insurrection, I can't say I'm the least bit surprised that the jury in the Derek Chauvin case was compromised. Whether Chauvin could get a fair and impartial jury was doubtful, as Andrew Branca and I explained in detail during our post-verdict online event. The problem was a combination of pretrial and ongoing threats of violence if there was not a guilty verdict, and an underlying lack of aggressiveness by the defense and the judge in weeding out biased jurors. Now there is evidence that at least one juror was tainted beyond repair, calling into question the legal viability of the verdict. And the first media outlet to report on this story was the Post-Millennial. Considering that it is a internet-only publication that few people seem to have heard of, it seems to break a lot of stories, doesn't it? Which suggests that the mainstream or regime media, as we're calling it now, isn't trying to break any stories, or simply decides that the less they say, the better for everyone. You can read the form of the jury questions. Since the protest Mitchell admits to attending was in D.C., not Minneapolis, he may have an out on question number 7. Did you or someone close to you participate in any of the demonstrations or marches against police brutality that took place in Minneapolis after Floyd's death? If you participated, explain how much you were involved. If you participated, did you carry a sign? What did it say? But it's hard to see a justification for answering question number 12 in the negative, other than what you have already described above. Have you or anyone close to you participated in protests about police use of force or police brutality? Yes or no? I would not be surprised if more information comes out about Mitchell being involved in protests. So Mitchell lied under any reasonable interpretation of the jury questions, and his participation in the protest. This could result in a mistrial. Juror number 52 presented as a youngish male. Obviously, the jurors were not shown on camera, but if I had to speculate based on the audio, I would guess that 52 was black. He was described as working in the banking industry in a customer-focused job, and separately being engaged in coaching children's sports. There was nothing much remarkable about the voir dire of 52. He professed he'd be willing to be fair to both sides, judging the case only on the evidence and law presented at court, even if he thought the law was wrong or should be charged, and that he could provide the defendant with a fair and impartial hearing. Interestingly, 52 had written in his juror questionnaire that he didn't believe anyone intended for Floyd to die that day. But nevertheless, the fact that Floyd did die suggested that something ought to be changed moving forward. He also recognized that there could be a thought process on the part of the officers that made their conduct reasonable despite the negative outcome. This juror also wrote in his questionnaire that he wondered why the other police officers involved had not intervened. When pressed by the defense to explore whether this meant he assumed Chauvin had acted wrongfully, 52 indicated not necessarily so. He compared it to if he were driving somewhat thoughtlessly and a passenger prompted him to pay more attention. The juror also noted in his questionnaire that he'd been arrested once himself for having a bad license, but that the officers involved had treated him professionally. He also somewhat agreed that the officers in this community made him feel safe. The defense also asked if the juror would be able to arrive at a not guilty verdict, knowing that he'd have to explain his decision to the kids he coached in sports. He said he would. The defense passed for cause, meaning that 52 was acceptable to the defense as a juror. Now, it turned out that we'd heard about this fellow a week ago because he decided to make himself famous. This is from the AP, April the 29th. Chauvin juror after intense trial, verdict was easy part. A juror who cast one of the unanimous votes to convict a white former Minneapolis police officer in George Floyd's death said Wednesday that deliberations were relaxed and methodical, and he and 11 other jurors quickly talked their way to agreement in parts of just 2 days. Was the first juror who deliberated to come forward publicly since Chauvin was convicted April 20th of second and third degree murder and second degree manslaughter. Mitchell said the jury room was a relief after 3 weeks of emotional testimony that he described as like a funeral day after day. It's not human nature to watch people die, Mitchell said in an interview with AP, describing testimony that day after day included video of Floyd's desperate cries as he was held down by Chauvin. I talked about this story when it came out, and I said that I was suspicious of it for this reason, that if one hears the same story over and over again, sees the same video over and over again, one becomes desensitized to it. And I suspect that Mitchell had watched this video many times, perhaps dozens of times, before the trial even began. But it seems that it wouldn't have made any difference if the jury in Minneapolis had found Chauvin not guilty. There's another story from the Star Tribune dated April 29th. Feds plan to indict Chauvin, other 3 officers on civil rights charges. Ex-cop would face federal charges in 2 cases, 3 others just in Floyd case. Leading up to Chauvin's murder trial, Justice Department officials have spent months gathering evidence to indict the ex-Minneapolis police officer on federal police brutality charges, but they feared the publicity frenzy could disrupt the state's case. So they came up with a contingency plan. If Chauvin were not found guilty on all counts, or the case ended in mistrial, they would arrest him at the courthouse, according to sources familiar with the planning discussions. How about that? You say, what about double jeopardy? No, but this isn't double jeopardy. Well, if Chauvin was found not guilty by a court, and then he was charged with the same crimes by another court, wouldn't that be double jeopardy? No, you don't understand. You don't understand the subtlety of this. It's completely different. How is it completely different? Chauvin was convicted on 3 counts because of his police brutality leading to Floyd's death. But in the second federal case, they would just be charging him with the police brutality. So as you can see, it's completely different. The same thing happened in the Rodney King trial. If the Federal Department of Justice decides to nail you, then you are done. It's over. Let's have a look at the chat. Hello to Roulette Cracked and Ann Run, Dan, Buddy Palcaso 88, and William Hicks. Roulette Cracked says, Mitchell says the deliberations were relatively straightforward, but there were a few hiccups with terminology and understanding exactly what the instructions were. Aren't you supposed to send a note to the judge if you were unsure about what the instructions are? Yes, and respectable commenting name got ahead of me on the story of the fix being in with regard to Chauvin. Hello to Gamion. Much like a certain respectable commenting name says, much like a certain event in recent history, the interference was very robust and diverse and impossible for a civilization not dedicated to an impartial result to prevent. Okay, do we have anything else here? Gamiston, with the name that I cannot pronounce previously, it looks Polish, says, we are all living in Tom Wolfe's final posthumous novel now. Hope you caught my article on the LA riots recently, Kevin, says Lamprey Milt. Indeed I did. Indeed I did. And I should talk about it, just to remind people how fraught it was back in 1992. It may well be getting fraught in America this summer. This is from Brian Walsh at Axios. After a year in which murders spiked in the U.S., homicides are already trending up in many cities, presaging what is likely to be a violent summer. Why it matters, Axios writes. Well, not pretentiously, patronizingly. The rise in homicides is a public health crisis that has multiple interlocking causes. I'm not even going to read that, okay? Driving the news from Washington to Louisville, Kentucky, New York to Oakland, and Kansas City to Atlanta, murder rates are trending up in U.S. cities large and small. A sample of 37 cities with data available for the first 3 months of 2021 collected by the crime analyst Jeff Asher indicates murders are up 18% over the same period in 2020. The continued increase comes after a year in which major U.S. cities experienced a 33% rise in homicides, and 63 of the 66 largest police jurisdictions saw an increase in at least one category of violent crime. After hitting a modern-day low in 2014, following a quarter century of general decline, homicide rates began rising again in many cities. Criminologists still haven't settled on a certain explanation for why violent crime dropped drastically from the 1990s, and why they're even less certain why it's risen so dramatically over the past 16 months. Oh, the Ferguson effect, as Steve Saylor has dubbed it, which is exactly what it is. First off, apparently all white people are racist, white supremacists, and they're looking to kill black people every time they leave their homes. Also, the police have been, well, it's been made known to them that it is not in their interest to arrest black suspects. It's not in the police's interest to arrest any suspects in Portland. This is James Gordon for the Daily Mail. The majority of the people facing federal charges over last summer's protests in Portland, Oregon, will not be prosecuted or spend any time at all behind bars, it has been revealed. Although 97 people were arrested and had charges filed against them in connection to protests that took place between May and October of last year, 58 cases have either been dismissed completely or will be scrapped under deferred resolution agreements. A further 32 cases are also pending, with many also likely to be dismissed, Fox News reports. Just 7 people have entered guilty pleas, and just 1 is heading to prison, having been caught red-handed setting fire to the city's Justice Center. Edward Shinzing was caught on video setting fire to the building. He had his shirt off and, helpfully for police, had his name tattooed on his back. So is that, if he forgot what his name was, then he can put his back up to a mirror and turn his head around and remind himself? Among those who have had charges dismissed are David Bouchard and Charles Comfort, who were both accused of attacking law enforcement officers. Well, I suppose if there's no charges, then there were no crimes, which is the line that the media is going to take. And who's responsible for this? Well, it's a man called Mike Schmidt, who is the district attorney of Multnomah County, which Portland is a part of. He says, the protesters are angry and deeply frustrated with what they perceive to be structural inequities in our basic social fabric. And this frustration can escalate to levels that violate the law. This policy acknowledges that centuries of disparate treatment of our Black and Brown communities have left deep wounds, and that the healing process will not be easy or quick. But Portland Police Chief Chuck Lovell said people who commit violent acts or intentionally damage property will still be held accountable. Committing a crime is different from demonstrating, Lovell said. The arrests we make often come after hours of damage to private property, disruption of public transit and traffic on public streets, thefts from small businesses, arson, burglary, attacks on members of the community, and attacks against police officers. Well, once again, oh yes, criminal activity, but if you're not going to be charged for it, is it still criminal activity? Has Multnomah County decided that continually attempting to burn down federal buildings in Portland is okay because people are upset? I have looked at the mugshots, or at least dozens of them, of people who have been charged for rioting in Portland, and these people are overwhelmingly white. There are not that many Black people living in Portland, a city which has been dubbed a white-topia, which horrifies the Portland Oregonian. A few years ago, they basically demanded, it seemed that, that something be done about this. Chad Wolf, the acting Secretary of Homeland Security under President Trump, slammed the decision to dismiss charges against alleged rioters. It's offensive to all the men and women who risked their lives in Portland for 90 to 120 days, or even longer in some cases, being attacked night after night after night. The prosecutors in that U.S. Attorney's Office, the number of prosecutors that support even the courthouse system, isn't really set up to handle those sorts of numbers, said former federal prosecutor Alex Little. Lisa Hay, the federal public defender in Oregon, has a slightly different take on the high number of cases being dismissed. I think the federal government went overboard in some of the ways they addressed these protests, said Lisa Hay. What we're seeing now is that many of the cases that were brought before the federal government's overreach are now being dismissed. So, yes, federal police defending a federal building is illegitimate, even as there are attempts made to burn it down and incinerate everyone inside. And in more crime news, this sort of thing is no longer shocking anymore, which is in itself rather shocking. There's a tweet from Richard Hanania. At a 12-year-old's birthday party in Louisiana, 9 children are shot. 60 people attended the party. Seems that none of them will talk to the police about it. Not as interesting to our national journalists as criminals getting shot while resisting arrest. This is a story back April 20th from the London Independent. 9 shot at child's 12th birthday party in Louisiana. Police has claimed that more than one weapon was used at the birthday party, in which 9 sustained gunshot wounds. Yes. What sort of people bring loaded weapons to children's birthday parties? What sort of people bring loaded weapons to children's baptisms? What sort of people bring loaded weapons to funeral homes? But we're not supposed to talk about that. It's too inconvenient. Black Lives Matter is in the news again. This is Monica Showalter at an American Thinker. Activists from BLM, not happy with merely defunding the police or raking in huge corporate donations as their objective, now want President Trump banned from all digital media and future office. That's the report from the Washington Examiner, which notes that they've put out and updated their list of demands. We are joining Representatives Ilhan Omar, Ayanna Pressley, Cori Bush, Jamal Bowman, and others who are demanding Trump be immediately convicted in the United States Senate, reads the first demand on the BLM website. Convicted of what? Convicted of what? Trump must also be banned from holding elected office in the future. The group also called on Trump to be permanently banned from all digital media platforms, arguing he uses the platforms recklessly and irresponsibly to spread lies and disinformation. Turning their attention to Trump loyalists in Congress, the activist group demanded that all GOP lawmakers that stoked Trump's conspiracy theories and encouraged the white supremacists to take action to overturn the election be expelled from Congress. Showalter comments, this in their case is a shakedown, given the damage they cause to cities, burning, looting, rioting when they don't get their way. So they're not really about Black Lives Mattering anymore. They're now about silencing and banning President Trump and throwing in a lot of praise for Joe Biden as a list of demands unrelated to Black lives at all continues. Yeah. This group is in a position to issue demands to the Congress of the United States. And here's a piece from VDare by Washington Watcher. Everyone knew the Biden regime would use the January 6th mostly peaceful protests as an excuse to crack down on patriotic Americans and Trump supporters. But news reports through the past 2 weeks demonstrate just what Biden and his leftist allies on Capitol Hill, big tech, and the regime media have in mind. A major surveillance operation involving not only the usual federal alphabet agencies, but also private informers to designate dissidents as terrorists and white supremacists, and co-opting the private sector to punish them, as in putting America First, Nicholas Fuentes, on the no-fly list. Let's start with today's alarming news. Biden plans to pay outside entities to surveil social media for information about extremist groups. And extremist groups doesn't mean Antifa and Black Lives Matters. The Department of Homeland Security is limited in how it can monitor citizens online without justification, and it's banned from activities like assuming false identities to gain access to private messaging apps used by extremist groups such as the Proud Boys or Oath Keepers. Instead, federal authorities can only browse through unprotected information on social media sites. The plan, being discussed inside DHS, according to multiple sources, would in effect allow the department to circumvent those limits. A source familiar with the effort said that it is not about decrypting data, but rather using outside entities who can legally access these private groups to gather large amounts of information that could help the DHS identify key narratives as they emerge. Yes, I wonder how big America's Stasi is going to become. VDR continues, it's a good guess that the outside entities will likely be the cultural Marxist vigilantes already tracking such extremists. And it turns out that a great many of the so-called right-wing publications in America have not even mentioned this case. VDR reports censorship footnote, as we go to Pixel, there has been not one regime media report on Nick Fuentes' travel ban, nor has it been mentioned in respectable right mouthpieces like the National Cuckview, the Daily Cucker, or Cuck Bart. I wonder why that might be. Before I move on to Andrew Cuomo and his ugly face and his even uglier soul, let's go back to the chat. William Hicks says Portland is the home of the pastiest of the pasty white people. Roulette Crack says uniforms are basically a tool for a complete stranger to encroach upon your personal liberty. All officials should be known by face and endorsed by locals and not need to have any need to wear a uniform. I don't know about that. You know, it makes it easier to determine who not to shoot. Again, from Roulette Crack, the idea of the government resolving all societal problems and crimes and not by the people directly affected on a local level is obviously a failed experiment. Yes. Where exactly does the Department of Justice have the constitutional right to determine what constitutes police brutality and to make that a crime? Wait, Saylor coined Ferguson effect? Indeed, he did. MF Superstar says, you'd think that in a period of super wonderful racial reckoning, society would take a time out on violent crime. The article, Lamprey Mills' article on the LA riots is in the American Sun. Okay, yes. Let's move on to Andrew Cuomo, who in a small way, a small grudging way, has my admiration for simply, I'm not going anywhere. I'm not going anywhere. I'm just going to brazen it out. Of course, Bill Clinton did the same thing. If Bill Clinton had any love for America, he would have resigned and not forced America through the humiliation that he put it through. The aforementioned Daily Caller has a video. Governor Cuomo to people who don't take the vaccine. Maybe you go home and kiss your grandmother and wind up killing your grandmother. The balls on that guy, huh? Yeah, and let's look at the deaths in New York and New Jersey. It's a similar policy versus the rest of the U.S. It just dwarfs them. Absolutely dwarfs them. You will recall that Andrew Cuomo forced nursing homes in the state of New York to accept people who were infected with COVID-19. And since the average death of people in the United States from COVID-19 is around the age of 80, one can imagine the effects. And the effects were that thousands of people died. How many? 5,000, 10,000, 15,000 more? Well, Cuomo denied it, said it wasn't his decision. And then he removed the order from the New York website. And then he got his aides to lie about it. And he's continued to lie about it, even as he wrote a book patting himself on the back for his wonderful leadership during COVID-19. And a particularly amusing tweet from him today. You're damn right, New York is coming back, and we're coming back stronger than ever before. You know, well, as they say, you cannot make an omelet without killing a few thousand grandmothers. Paul Joseph Watson has a piece on Summit News. Unlike other areas of the country like Texas and Florida, New York appears to be trapped in a permanent state of lockdown malaise, with one observer noting how empty streets suggest the city is seemingly as dead as it was a year ago. Reason host Nick Gillespie tweeted a video of morning rush hour on the Bowery, a street located in a normally busy neighborhood of Manhattan. Suffice to say, it's not that busy. And I'm looking at the video, and amazingly, there are hardly any cars on the street at 7:30 in the morning. Respondents blamed harsh coronavirus lockdown restrictions for the city's decline. Everyone moved to Florida, remarked one. It's absolutely tragic what these morons have done to my beautiful city. It's going to take years to recover from this, commented another. A survey conducted in September 2020 found that 2 in 5 New Yorkers wanted to leave the city, with the reasons cited being crime and public safety, as well as the anemic post-COVID economic recovery. Removal trucks became a common sight on the streets, with 2020 showing a 44% increase in home sales in the suburbs compared to the same time period in 2019, as people flee for bigger homes in safer areas. Former hedge fund manager and entrepreneur James Altucher previously warned that the city was on its knees and that there were no signs of New York's political leadership offering a way out of the malaise. We have something like 30 to 50% of the restaurants in New York City are probably out of business, and they're not coming back. Regular Black Lives Matter riots that include demonstrators telling white people to get the F out of New York also can't be helping. The trend of people fleeing big cities, largely as a result of the pandemic, but also for other reasons, is mirrored in London, where 700,000 people left the English capital in 2020. Yes, who are those people and where are they going? It's all very well to laugh at New York City's misfortunes, but if liberal New Yorkers are heading to places that aren't screwed up, well, New York is still going to stay screwed up because the plurality of idiots in New York City is unapproachable. But these people leaving in New York in the hundreds of thousands could make a big difference in other localities and states. How long is it going to last? Forever, apparently. Again, from Paul Joseph Watson, the same source. Dr. David Thunder warns that governments have now set the precedent for draconian lockdown measures to be introduced at the drop of a hat every time there is a harsh flu season. In a video clip, Thunder, a university lecturer and researcher in moral, political, and social philosophy, says that COVID will now recede across the Western Hemisphere due to seasonal variation and naturally acquired immunity. However, he cautions that this in no way means an end to the restrictions. Quote, governments will attempt to take credit for the lull in COVID infections and hospitalizations. They will claim that we were only able to open up and return to some semblance of normality because of their draconian restrictions on social life. They will suggest that our enjoyment of normal life is due to their wise stewardship of the pandemic and their graciousness in relaxing restrictions, adding that they will conveniently ignore the fact that countries like Sweden and states like Florida and Texas, which never fully locked down, showed similar patterns in the remission of COVID-19. If you are a faithful listener of this live stream, you will know that I made the exact same prediction as Dr. David Thunder in March of last year. He tweets in the video, "The future of democracy is in our hands. A harsh flu season will be enough to set in motion the wheels of tyranny based on a misguided and morally abhorrent approach to disease control until citizens peacefully resist this slide into tyranny." He says that most people will take whatever breadcrumbs of normality fall from the table of their captors. Make no mistake about it, this nightmare will not be over until citizens push back and say enough is enough. Governments are now armed with a powerful excuse to suspend citizens' civil liberties whenever there's a winter resurgence in respiratory viruses. Message, this is not over until we, that is to say the experts, say that it is. I think will reimpose masking in the winter on crowded indoor spaces. It has the benefit of reducing flu, said Professor James Naismith of Oxford University. His sentiments were echoed by Professor Paul Hunter of East Anglia University, who said masks would continue to be required on public transport and in other settings even after the pandemic is over. But I guess we're all going to have to get the jab, even if we have to keep wearing masks. There's another story from the Post-Millennial, which covers both Canada and the United States. On Saturday, the government of Washington, D.C. enacted a new rule that completely bans dancing and even standing during wedding receptions. In what has been described as a scene straight out of Footloose, the administration of the amusingly named Mayor Muriel Bowser put the new law into effect Saturday, right at the beginning of the traditional wedding season. The new rule applies to indoor as well as outdoor weddings. Outdoor weddings. Event planner Stephanie Sadowski told a local news outlet that she was completely shell-shocked. There's hardly been any time to react, rather than being incredibly frustrated and angry with Washington, D.C. and Mayor Bowser for completely blindsiding us. I can't even believe we're in 2021 right now and we're saying no dancing. Why can't we just have masks? Sadowski said that this has been a deal breaker for her clients, and she is now looking at suburban locations in neighboring Virginia or Maryland where rules may be more amenable to them. Are weddings a bad thing? Is that the idea? I'm reminded that in Yacht Rock, the joke was that the original name for the script of Footloose was The Boy Who Danced Away Oppression, which I think is quite a good joke. Let's see what William Briggs, statistician to the stars, has for us today. DeSantis, that is Governor Ron DeSantis of Florida, suspends all local COVID-19 emergency orders. Although the governor was met with enthusiasm during his news conference in St. Petersburg Monday, some local leaders say they were blindsided by the announcement and fear it undermines their authority to protect residents. Briggs comments, by which they mean protect their newly created powers, which they are loath to release. The New York Times admits this when it wonders just will restore normalcy. Good grief. It is only their acts that took normalcy away. Our rulers use our own hands to smack us with while saying, stop hitting yourself. Oh, and he reminds us of this video by Jeff Nyquist of leaders, world leaders, and there are dozens of them, and they're all saying the same thing. Build back better. Build back better. They're all saying that for some reason. He comments, remind me again what a conspiracy theory is. A paper by Kai Kieselinski and a slew of others asks, is a mask that covers the mouth and nose free from undesirable side effects in everyday use and free of potential hazards? Apparently not. Here's the list of negative effects documented across many papers. Lowered oxygen, upward carbon dioxide, increased humidity and temperature, increased breathing resistance, increased respiratory rate, increased blood pressure, cerebral vasodilation, increased heart rate, respiratory impairment, exhaustion and fatigue, drowsiness, dizziness, headache, psychovegetative effect, decrease in empathy, itch, skin irritation, acne, rhinitis, voice disorder, false sense of security, bacterial contamination, fungal contamination, and the best for last, viral contamination. Even ignoring the wee p-values, the results are obvious. Yes, you may have heard this from a few days ago. Overheard in DC. I guess I'm vaccinated, so I don't have to wear a mask outside, but I really don't want people to think I'm a Republican. Sink Wigger had this to say. Now people are saying they won't travel to red states because it's a danger to be around conservatives. Nearly half of Republicans say they won't take the vaccine. It's literally hazardous to your health to be around this death cult. Their ignorance has reached a clinical level. Oh, they're insane, are they? And who's in charge of the death cult? Oh, and the original version of this flamboyant homosexual in a purple suit singing a song of praise and supplication to Joe Biden with the tune Mr. Sandman. Demographics of the U.S. vaccination campaign from Battle Beagle: 63% female, 30% male. Dr. Barron, 17th century shite poster DDS, says this falls in line with nearly all the anecdotes I've heard about intra-family pressure campaigns to force everyone in the clan to get vaxxed. I'm not hyper-skeptical of the vaxxes, but the movement is driven hard by longhouse instincts and should be distrusted on that level alone. Key quotation from the thread: the cynical excision and replacement of public debate with machined precision propaganda should be enough for anyone who is not psychopathic. Look, you've already won. You control both the measurements and the belief in the measurements. The fact that they still feel the need to take that second step, the one that then declares you a criminal for disagreeing with them, is the clearest possible evidence that this regime's chief concern isn't freedom, democracy, or even science. Their own obsession with certain words reveals the only things that matter to them: power and oppression. The ruling powers manipulate the former away from us so that they are most free to wield the latter against us. Once is coincidence, always it's exposed as the rule. That's a paraphrase of something that Ian Fleming once wrote, and it goes like this: once is happenstance, two is coincidence, three times is enemy action. In that thread, shite linked to a Nature piece: COVID vaccines, time to confront anti-vax aggression. And Briggs comments, aggression. One poster summarized this article in Nature published yesterday essentially calls for anti-vaccines groups to be dismantled and treated by the law like terrorists and cyber criminals. Anti-science is now approaching similar levels of peril as nuclear armament. The totalitarian impulse of the debased left to demand that those who won't be vaxxed be punished as criminals is to be noted. It's not, I think, that the corona doom is anything special to them. It's that they do not like having their ideas questioned. Questions are blasphemy. They will not be disobeyed. Incidentally, the hack who wrote that piece says earlier on it this: I experienced sinking feelings during our Zoom calls. Yes, all the vaccine propaganda, writes John Lakatch, is 100 times worse than any of those videos of dancing nurses on TikTok. I'm looking at a video here of an awful lot of people in the street, the highway in Montreal, complaining about the lockdown. There are certainly, as with most or all vaccines, side effects. The problem is tracking them. There appears to be great reluctance to do that here. Nevertheless, evidence is accumulating. One doctor says 70% with the Johnson & Johnson vax have side effects, and he will have more on that next week. Yes, and everyone is screaming about India without noticing that India, as Briggs points out, has 1.3 billion people. So if the infection rates are roughly similar, obviously you're going to have a lot more cases and deaths in India than elsewhere. And moving on here, this was interesting and has not got much publicity. It's from Mike Whitney at uns.com yesterday. This is from a piece from Doctors for COVID Ethics. The risk-benefit calculus is therefore clear. The experimental vaccines are needless, ineffective, and dangerous. Actors authorizing, coercing, or administering experimental COVID-19 vaccination are exposing populations and patients to serious, unnecessary, and unjustified medical risks. Why is that? In the new study, which is from an article dated April the 30th, the researchers created a pseudovirus that was surrounded by SARS-CoV classic crown of spike proteins, but did not contain any actual virus. Exposure to this pseudovirus resulted in damage to the lungs and arteries of an animal model, proving that the spike protein alone was enough to cause disease. Tissue samples showed inflammation in endothelial cells aligning the pulmonary artery walls. Note, vascular endothelial cells line the entire circulatory system from the heart to the smallest capillaries. The team then replicated this process in the lab, exposing healthy endothelial cells, which line arteries to the spike protein. They showed that the spike protein damaged the cells by binding ACE2. This binding disrupted ACE2's molecular signaling to mitochondria, organelles that generate energy for cells, causing the mitochondria to become damaged and fragmenting. Previous studies have shown a similar effect when cells were exposed to the SARS-CoV virus, but this is still the first study to show that the damage occurs when cells are exposed to the spike protein on its own. Whitney says the new research paper is the equivalent of a hydrogen bomb. It changes everything by confirming what vaccine critics have been theorizing for months but were unable to prove. Now, there is solid evidence that, one, COVID-19 is primarily a disease of the vascular system, also called the circulatory system, which is made up of vessels that carry blood and lymph through the body and not the respiratory system. Two, the main culprit is the spike protein. Dictionary definition, it's a glycoprotein that protrudes from the envelope of some viruses. Like a key in a lock, these spike proteins fuse to receptors on the surface of cells, allowing the virus's genetic code to invade the host cell, take over its machinery, and replicate. I hope we're going to see more on this study. Whether one agrees with warp speed or not, and I've never agreed with it from the beginning, I think it is perfectly justified to say that all of these vaccines are experimental vaccines, and that several of them are not vaccines as vaccines have been traditionally understood. Meanwhile, my old friend Jason Kenney, now Premier of Alberta, is going back into panic mode. And he has reached that terrible situation for a politician where he is now hated by practically everyone. Graham Thompson for the CBC hates him because he was not draconian enough. But he makes a good point about Kenney. That Kenney talks about liberties and freedoms, but he can't seem to figure out which side he is on. For months, Kenney has downplayed the risk of transmissions in schools and resisted pleas from teachers to get them vaccinated. On Monday, Kenney announced teachers and others in contact with students could get a jab starting Tuesday. Thompson says it was the right action to take, but Kenney is loath to admit he made a mistake by not acting sooner. Also on Monday, he accused others of playing the blame game with COVID-19 and then a mere breath later threw shade on the federal government for not closing the border to international travelers sooner. And he also, threw shade on people who went to a rodeo in Alberta after earlier blaming members of the South Asia community for apparently, living lives. It's everyone's fault but his. And so a circuit breaker was announced for Alberta today. And before we move on to describing that circuit breaker, let's have a look at the numbers. And these are the latest numbers as of end of day yesterday. Keep in mind that there are 4.4 million people living in the province of Alberta. Current hospitalizations, 671. Current ICU, 150. Total deaths, 2,099. I reckon that to be fewer than 200 a month in once again, a province of 4.4 million people. Average age of death, 81 years. Stop the spike. Expanded restrictions for hotspot regions, which are Fort McMurray, Red Deer, Okotoks, Grand Prairie, Airdrie, Calgary, Rocky View County, Lethbridge, Strathcona County, Edmonton, and St. Albert. Did he leave anything out? Oh, in addition to these additional measures, all other province-wide restrictions remain in effect. And places of worship, I found this interesting. Faith services are limited to 15% of fire code occupancy for in-person attendance. Physical distancing between households must be maintained. Mask use is mandatory. Virtual or online services are recommended. In-person faith group meetings and other religious gatherings are not permitted in private homes while these measures are in effect. So we've had talk of underground churches in Alberta, and Jason Kenney has decided to ban underground churches. Faith leaders and other speakers can remove their masks while speaking if there is a distance of 2 meters. The mask must be put on again once finished speaking. Group performance activities such as choir singing and playing music are permitted if they are normal worship practices and not for the purpose of entertainment. Performers must wear masks at all times. What if they're playing, trumpets, woodwind instruments, the like? They expected to play a mask through them. Some businesses are required to temporarily close, reduce capacity, or limit in-person access. Masks are mandatory in all indoor public places, indoor workplaces, and places of worships. And what? In-person service, that is restaurant service, not permitted indoors. Yes. Oh, and liquor service ends at 10 p.m. because of some sort of connection between COVID-19 and the consumption of alcohol. No entertainment allowed. Video lottery terminals, pool tables, live music, etc. And there's hundreds of other restrictions. This is the third or fourth go round for Alberta. It hasn't made any difference in the past, and it's not going to make any difference in the future. But Jason Kenney is terrified of being called weak, even if he consistently demonstrates himself to be a weakling. He could have said, like the governor of South Dakota, I'm not doing any of this nonsense. And if he had done so, Alberta would be looking pretty good right now. Let's go to Alex Berenson's Twitter feed. Mark March 9th, 2020 on your calendars. Tony Fauci told the truth, quote, "It's so clear that the overwhelming weight of serious disease and mortality is on those who are elderly and those with a serious comorbidity," unquote. Berenson comments he wouldn't make that mistake again. He talks about the piece which I mentioned yesterday. Nicholas Wade, who covered science for the New York Times for 30 years, is a must-read. It lays out in terrific detail the overwhelming evidence that SARS-CoV-2 is the product of a Chinese lab accident. Let's see. Masking guidelines. This is from LA Public Health. Masking guidelines for the fully vaccinated. You can be without a mask outdoors when alone, with members of your household, with a small group of fully vaccinated people, with a small group of people not fully vaccinated and not at higher risk. Or Berenson says, or you can be without a mask outdoors all the time, whether or not you've gone near a vaccine. That also works. Yes, the panic is not going to be allowed to end. James Surowicki says Yale New Haven Hospital's chief medical officer says they are seeing major hesitancy from people when it comes to the Johnson & Johnson vaccine. This suggests that the decision to pause the J&J vaccine for almost 2 weeks at the very least did not bolster people's confidence in the vaccine, and at worst it actually made people more concerned about it. And Berenson comments, good. Amy Siskind, who has a rainbow flag and a blue tick, who is an activist, feminist, and author. She's on the Weekly List website and podcast. She's a former Wall Street executive. She tweeted, facts, nearly 150 million Americans have had at least one vaccine dose. 0 have died from it. 33 million have tested positive for COVID. Nearly 600,000 have died from it. Hundreds still dying from it each day. Berenson comments, facts, this is untrue. We have no idea how many Americans have died from being vaccinated, but we know that the number is not 0. Serious scientists do not dispute the Johnson & Johnson vaccine deaths. Yes, and where are all the investigative reporters all out sick after the second dose? Well, they've gone all in on masks and social distancing and vaccine, and they're going to remain all in on it. What are they going to say? Oh, we were wrong about that. We scared you to death for little reason. But keep on buying our products and submit to our authoritatively declared opinions. This is from Jack Hadfield at the National File. A Christian Finnish politician has been charged with multiple hate crimes after she tweeted a Bible verse and criticized homosexuality and could face up to 6 years in prison as a result. Pavi Räsänen, and I'm sure I mispronounced that, a current Finnish member of parliament and former minister of the interior, was charged last week on 3 hate crimes counts, having been accused of engaging in hate speech for posting about her Christian beliefs on homosexuality. The Finnish prosecutor general, a leftist who considers communist Nelson Mandela to be her, quote, guru, unquote, announced that after opening the investigation into Räsänen in September 2019, the state had enough evidence to charge her. The 3 incidents that Räsänen, who previously led the Christian Democratic Party, is being charged with spans a time period of well over a decade. In 2004, she published a booklet about the Bible and sexuality. In 2018, she spoke on a talk radio show on the topic of what would Jesus think about homosexuals. In 2019, she posted the Bible verse Romans, chapter 1, verses 24 to 27, in order to criticize the participation of the Finnish Lutheran Church in the Alphabet People Pride Festival that took place last year, with this last offense being the one that triggered the investigation as a whole. According to YLE, the Finnish prosecutor general said that her statements were derogatory and discriminatory against homosexuals and violated their equality and dignity, and that as a result, her comments would overstep the boundaries of freedom of speech and religion and are likely to fuel intolerance, contempt, and hatred. Each count could result in a 2-year prison sentence or fine, meaning that she could be facing up to 6 years in prison. Oh, a not related story, but interesting nonetheless. Finland's migrant rapes soar 157% in 1 year. But we know what Finland's more serious problem. People quoting the Bible. Oh, and here's a good news on the free speech front. This is from Reuters. French far-right politician and presidential candidate Marine Le Pen was acquitted Tuesday by a court after facing a trial over publishing images of Islamic State or ISIS or ISIL atrocities on Twitter in December 2015, which prosecutors said broke hate speech laws. Le Pen, whom opinion polls say is likely to face President Emmanuel Macron in the 2022 presidential election final round vote, had tweeted the images after some French media carried comments comparing her National Front Party, now renamed Rassemblement National, to Islamic State. She tweeted the images of ISIS atrocities to highlight what she said was the absurdity of the comparison. She had denied any wrongdoing and slammed a politically motivated trial and an attack against freedom of speech. Oh, and on the triggering front, this is a story from Lucas Manfredi at Fox Business. Just days after Disneyland has reopened with an update to its Snow White attraction, the move is already receiving backlash. According to Disney, Snow White's Enchanted Wish takes guests aboard a wooden minecart as they accompany the princess as she escapes the clutches of the evil queen. Begin your fairy tale journey in the cozy cottage of the Seven Dwarfs, then visit dazzling mines filled with glowing gems. Soon you'll be riding into the Queen's sorcery chamber and discovering a magic mirror just as Snow White bites into a poisoned apple. A description on the theme park's website reads, "When all looks lost, will Snow White find her own happily ever after?" The ride is enhanced with new music, LED backlighting, laser projections, an animation system, and new scenes, including Snow White dancing. I certainly hope she's not twerking. And the evil queen's collections of spell books and bubbling potions. Ooh, that's a lot like religious bigotry. Is it not? It's the True Love's Kiss grand finale between Snow White and her prince that is drawing scrutiny from the San Francisco Gate. The new grand finale of Enchanted Wish is the moment when the prince finds Snow White asleep under the evil queen's spell and gives her true love's kiss to release her from the enchantment, the outlet writes. A kiss he gives to her without her consent while she's asleep, which cannot possibly be true love if only one person knows it's happening. Oh, okay. So if someone comes across someone unconscious on the street, perhaps someone who has stopped breathing, and applies CPR or other treatment, that is clearly without the patient's consent, and therefore must be evil. The Gate continues, haven't we already agreed that consent in early Disney movies is a major issue? That teaching kids that kissing, when it hasn't been established, if both parties are willing to engage, is not okay? It's hard to understand why the Disneyland of 2021 would choose to add a scene with such old-fashioned ideas of what a man is allowed to do to a woman, especially given the company's current emphasis on removing problematic scenes from rides like Jungle Cruise and Splash Mountain. Why not reimagine an ending in keeping with the spirit of the movie and Snow White's place in the Disney canon, but that avoids this problem? I don't know, maybe they could have made it a lesbian kiss and then it would have been perfectly acceptable. Or just make them, both characters non-binary. I was talking earlier about the purge at base camp, and it turns out the story is rather more complicated than people had thought at first. This is from The Verge, and it is by Casey Newton. Basecamp CEO last Friday gathered his remote workforce together on Zoom to apologize 4 days earlier, he had thrown the company into turmoil by announcing that societal and political discussions would no longer be allowed on the company's internal chat forums. In his blog post, Fried said the decision stemmed from the fact that today's social and political waters are especially choppy, and that internal discussions of those issues was not healthy and hasn't served us well. The public reaction had been furious. And Fried said he was sorry for the way the new policies had been rolled out, but not for the policies themselves. Behind the scenes, Fried had been dealing with an employee reckoning, mind you, over a long-standing company practice of maintaining a list of funny customer names, some of which were of Asian and African origin. The internal discussion over that list had been oriented primarily around making Basecamp feel more inclusive to its employees and customers, but Fried and his co-founder, now this might strike some people as a funny name, David Heinemeier Hansen, had been taken aback by an employee post which argued that mocking customer names laid the foundation for racially motivated violence and closed the thread. They also disbanded an internal committee of employees who had volunteered to work on issues related to diversity, inclusion, and equity. That's the proper order, D-I-E, die. So, crying, is there crying in this story? Is there weeping? I think that there is. Here we go. Yes. Okay. The employee called for the founders to denounce white supremacy. That would be the bare minimum for me, they said. I'm not here to share my personal views on anything Fried said. I'm horrified when one group dominates another. Fried, who is Jewish, added that he had lost relatives during the Holocaust. I think it's absolutely the most disgusting thing in the world. I can't say that's happening here. Fried added that he didn't know what to say about specific items. I don't know how to satisfy that right now, while Hansen remained on mute. It was in that exchange that several employees decided to quit Basecamp, I'm told. 2 employees told me they had found themselves crying and screaming at the screen. Yeah, well, this is one of the ways in which we're going to win, because our enemies are literally triggering themselves to death. I mentioned Paul Joseph Watson a couple times earlier in the show, and according to antihate.ca, that is the Canadian anti-hate network, he is a far-right extremist. He seemed like a reasonable fellow to me. Oh, he's a far-right vlogger, Paul Joseph Watson. So people were complaining, including Watson, that the city of Hamilton decided that BIPOC, racialized populations, were going to get vaccination priority. And people complained about this, and this is outrageous. According to antihate.ca, Ian Miles Chung's stunning medical commentary aside, other more overt features from the further right on the spectrum weighed in as well. Thank you for doing your part to protect white people, a global minority, from the terrible health consequences of the vaccines, especially infertility, wrote white nationalist musician Cat Weiss, one half of the band Uberfolk, with the Canadian former Rahowa frontman and still neo-Nazi George Birdie. I've never heard of the first person, and the second person, I don't believe I've heard that name mentioned for 15 or 20 years. POC are being affected by COVID because of racist white people and systemic racism, wrote Lana Lockteff of the white nationalist podcast Red Ice. So the answer is institutional racism against whites. So yes, anti-hate.ca is very, very upset because people are criticizing vaccines. What that has to do with racism is an interesting question, given that we know that Black people are more likely to decline the vaccine than white people. They're also upset because people are complaining that racialized communities are being given preferment in this regard, but of course they should, because that's equity. And if you're against equity, you're a white supremacist. Let's see. The key factor that the hundreds of comments and retweets ignore is both the moral and public health reasoning for these types of targeted programs. The pandemic does not discriminate, but the conditions that lead to exposure are firmly rooted in racism and inequity. Race doesn't put you at higher risk. Racism puts you at higher risk, says physician Camera Phyllis Jones. She added that everything from chronic disease, which is a made-up disease, to education can have a massive impact on health outcomes. Well, it would appear that the virus does discriminate then. And, okay, another story from Canada. This is from the CBC, Ryan Patrick Jones. A group that advocates for the rights of migrants is pushing for changes to a recently announced short-term immigration program, calling it unfair and exclusionary. Immigration Minister Marco Mendicino announced last month a new immigration pathway that will allow up to 90,000 essential workers and international graduates already in Canada to convert their temporary status to permanent status. The program, which will begin accepting applications Thursday, is a rare opportunity for low-wage, low-skilled workers to obtain permanent residency. Yes, that's exactly the sort of people that we want in Canada as immigrants, because Canadians couldn't possibly do those jobs. And eventually Canadian citizenship through an immigration system that normally prioritizes highly skilled workers. No, it doesn't. Only about 15% of immigrants to Canada come through on the so-called point system. But the Migrant Rights Network says a huge number of workers, students, and recent graduates with temporary or no documented immigration status don't meet the application requirements. The group that says that those who do qualify are scrambling to obtain the necessary language test results and other required documents as they compete for a limited number of first-come, first-served spots. Yes, that's what Canada needs. With our tremendously high unemployment and a shattered economy, is an enormous influx of people who can't speak English or French and have no skills. Yes, Canada welcomed 185,000 immigrants in 2020, the lowest number for any year since 1998. Golly, I wonder why that might be. Canada's target for 2020 was 341,000 new immigrants. Canada only has 38 million people. Trudeau is bringing in over 1.2 million people over the next 3 years, which will drive up real estate prices through the roof. Apparently, they're not high enough already in Canada for Princess Rockstar and his regime. Let's go to the chat. Don Willis says KMG's gay fab take on vocals whilst reading is choice. Well, thank you. Hello to Tom Anderson de Boreas. I bet there is a lot of literally shaking going on, says Roulette Cracked. Roulette Crack says, KMG, please do a gay Australian accent. Your audience demands it. I'd have to work on that. Hello to our moderator, Chad Chadson, our valiant moderator. Thank you for your service. Making a Denver omelet and home fries, says Chogokin 666. What exactly are home fries? I know what, French fries are chips, as we used to call them in Canada, and I've made them myself, cutting up potatoes and frying them in oil. What are home fries? I know there was a movie called Home Fries. William Hicks says, oh yes, the Jane's Addiction song was, of course, one must meet the other who runs free before him, put them right in his mouth while fantasizing the beauty of his movements. Our Finnish friend Jaakko Raipala says they're inventing a special rule to charge Räsänen for stuff that she said 20 years ago to get past the statute of limitations. This has never been done for manslaughter, just for this political crime. So this is a former leader of the Christian Democrats. This is a former cabinet minister. I'm rather surprised by this because, in countries which require coalitions that don't use the first past the post, they're extraordinarily corrupt. And the attitude is very much the dogs don't bite dogs. Because if all of the politicians turned on each other in any of these proportional representation countries, they'd all be in prison. Okay. Meanwhile, all nightclubs in China are packed, says Diboreus. My blood vessels are healthy, says Star Rover. Thrombosis deaths are all COVID deaths now, says Diboreus. Okay. If true that C19 is a vascular disease and not a respiratory disease, then the panic has had a bogus basis. That would be true. That would be true. And my trail of disgrace says the pro-jab, pro-lockdown parody videos of Missy Model have to be seen to be believed beyond cringe. These fake Indian headlines, says Roulette cracked like she had to carry a body in a rickshaw. Bog standard daily events there are repurposed for shock values. Yes, apparently footage from several years ago is being repurposed for shock value. As I say, I saw one of these stories about India and the panic with a picture of a highway in India, and in all honesty, I have never seen so much air pollution in my life. Okay, Don Willis says, real home fries from the South are taters and onions. Okay, that sounds good. Yakuropila says the Christian party is like 5%. They see a chance to wipe it out completely. Also, they're much more committed Christians than most Christian Democrats in Europe, like Merkel's Germany, etc. Okay, I'm going to read from Hilaire Belloc's The Servile State and the Destruction, his account of how the distributive state was lost in England. It was important to grasp clearly the nature of this operation, that is to say, the seizing of the monastic lands by the crown, for the whole economic future of England was to flow from it. Of the demesne lands and the power of local administration which they carried with them, a very important feature, as we shall see later, rather more than a quarter were in the hands of the church. The church was therefore the lord of something over 25%, say 28%, or perhaps nearly 30%, of English agricultural communities, and the overseers of a like proportion of all English agricultural produce. The church was further the absolute owner in practice of something like 30% of the demesne land in the villages, and the receiver of something like 30% of the customary dues, etc., paid by the smaller owners to the greater. All this economic power lay until 1535 in the hands of cathedral chapters, communities of monks and nuns, educational establishments conducted by the clergy, and so forth. When the monastic lands were confiscated by Henry VIII, not the whole of this vast economic influence was suddenly extinguished. The secular clergy, that is the clergy that are not in religious orders, remained endowed, and most of the educational establishments, though looted, retained some revenue. But though the whole 30% did not suffer confiscation, something well over 20% did, and the revolution effected by this vast operation was by far the most complete, the most sudden, and the most momentous of any that has taken place in the economic history of any European people. It was at first intended to retain this great mass of the means of production in the hands of the crown. That must be clearly remembered by any student of the fortunes of England, and by all who marvel at the contrast between the old England and the new. Had that intention been firmly maintained, the English state and its government would have been the most powerful in Europe. The executive, which in those days meant the king, would have had a greater opportunity for crushing the resistance of the wealthy, for backing its political power with economic power, and for ordering the social life of its subjects than any other executive in Christendom. Had Henry VIII and his successors kept the land thus confiscated, the power of the French monarchy, at which we are astonished, would have been nothing to the power of the English. The King of England would have had in his own hands an instrument of control of the most absolute sort. He would have presumably have used it, as a strong central government always does, for the weakening of the wealthier classes and to the indirect advantage of the mass of the people. At any rate, it would have been a very different England indeed from the England we know if the king had held fast to his own after the dissolution of the monasteries. Now, it is precisely here that the capital point in the Great Revolution appears. The king failed to keep the lands he had seized. That class of large landowners, which had already existed and controlled, as I've said, anything from a quarter to a third of the agricultural values of England, were too strong for the monarchy. They insisted upon land being granted to themselves, sometimes freely, sometimes for ridiculously small sums, and they were strong enough in Parliament and through the local administrative power they had to see that their demands were satisfied. Nothing that the crown let go ever went back to the crown, and year after year, more of that which had been the monastic land became the absolute possession of the large landowners. And you can see here, it's my comment, that there was a tripartite system in England before Henry VIII, where you had three roughly equal power sources: the king, the aristocracy, and the church. And when the church was crushed by Henry VIII, in fact, Henry VIII instituted a theocratic dictatorship of his own. But you see how this unbalanced the power in England. Bellop continues, observe the effect of this. All over England, men who had already held in virtually absolute property from 1/4 to 1/3 of the soil and the plows and the barns of a village became possessed in a very few years of a further great section of the means of production, which turned the scale wholly in their favor. They added to that third a new and extra fifth. They became at a blow the owners of half the land. In many centers of capital importance, they had come to own more than half the land. They were in many districts not only the unquestioned superiors, but the economic masters of the rest of the community. They could buy to the greatest advantage. They were strictly competitive, getting every shilling of due and of rent where the old clerical landlords had been customary, leaving much to the tenant. They began to fill the universities, the judiciary. The crown less and less decided between great and small. More and more, the great could decide in their own favor. They soon possessed, by those operations, the bulk of the means of production, and they immediately began the process of eating up the small independent men and gradually forming those great estates in which the course of a few generations became identical with the village itself. All over England, you may notice that the great squires' houses date from this revolution or after it. The manorial house, the house of a local great man, as it was in the Middle Ages, survives here and there to show of what immense effect this revolution was. The low-timbered place with its steadings and outbuildings, only a larger farmhouse among the other farmhouses, is turned after the Reformation and thenceforth into a palace. Save where great castles, which were only held of the crown and not owned, made an exception, the pre-Reformation gentry lived as men richer than, but not the masters of, other farmers around them. After the Reformation, there began to arise all over England those great country houses, which rapidly became the typical centers of English agricultural life. The process was in full swing before Henry died. Unfortunately for England, he left as his heir a sickly child during the 6 years of whose reign, from 1547 to 1553, the loot went on at an appalling rate. When he died and Mary came to the throne, it was nearly completed. A mass of new families had arisen, wealthy out of all proportion to anything which the older England had known, and bound by a common interest to the older families which had joined in the grab. Every single man who sat in Parliament for a country required his price for voting the dissolution of the monasteries. Every single man received it. A list of the members of the dissolution Parliament is enough to prove this, and apart from their power in Parliament, this class had 100 other ways of insisting on their will. The Howards, already of some lineage, the Cavendishes, the Cecils, the Russells, and 50 other new families thus rose upon the ruins of religion, and the process went steadily on until, about 100 years after its inception, the whole face of England was changed. In the place of a powerful crown disposing of revenues far greater than that of any subject, you had a crown at its wits' end for money and dominated by subjects, some of whom were its equals in wealth and who could, especially through the action of Parliament, which they now controlled, do much what they willed with government. In other words, by the first third of the 17th century, by 1630 to 40, the economic revolution was finally accomplished, and the new economic reality, thrusting itself upon the old traditions of England, was a powerful oligarchy of large owners overshadowing an impoverished and dwindled monarchy. Other causes had contributed to this deplorable result. The change in the value of money had hit the crown very hard. The peculiar history of the Tudor family, their violent passions, their lack of resolution and of any continuous policy, to some extent the character of Charles I himself, and many other subsidiary causes may be quoted, but the great main fact upon which the whole thing is dependent is that the monastic lands, at least a fifth of the wealth of the country, had been transferred to the great landowners, and that this transference had tipped the scale over entirely in their favor as against the peasantry. And I will have more from the servile state tomorrow. I'll be talking about K-pop in a few minutes, delayed one day from yesterday. This is a story from the Daily Mail from Nikki Schwab. George W. Bush remains a shameless man. Bush says that the Republicans won't win anything if they stand for white Anglo-Saxon Protestantism, and slams his own party for not being inclusive. Bush had been asked about an effort spearheaded by Representative Marjorie Taylor Greene to form a caucus in favor of Anglo-Saxon political traditions. I wonder if George W. Bush, he went to what, 2 Ivy League universities? He went to Harvard and Yale. I wonder if he learned anything about Anglo-Saxon political traditions at these venerable institutions. You know, to me, that basically says that we want to be extinct, the former Republican president added. Why would that be? Because the Anglo-Saxon people in America, their descendants, are going to be dealt with in some way. Bush is doing the rounds to promote his new book of paintings, Out of Many One, that showcase the American immigrant experience. Out of Many One. Too funny. Is that what's happening in America now? My whole point on all this immigration debate and stuff is, I think if we valued life as precious and every life matters, that we're all God's children, that all of a sudden the tone of the debate might be a little bit better. Bush told hosts Sarah Isgur and Steve Hayes. Yeah, I'm just going to repeat that again. If we valued life as precious and every life matters, that we're all God's children. Are the Iraqis God's children? W? Because Bush lied America into a war, an invasion of Iraq. And how many people died? Well, this is a controversial subject. According to Lancet survey, which is itself quite controversial, between March 2003 and July 2006, 655,000 estimated deaths. We have from Opinion Research Business estimated deaths of slightly over 1 million people. The PLOS Medicine study, 405,000 Iraqis. Documented deaths from violence from 2003 to 2011, somewhere between 103,000 to 114,000 civilian deaths recorded. And the Associated Press pegs that number at 110,000, 600,000. Again, my question is, are the Iraqis God's children as well, or just the Central Americans? Yes, I know that W's brother married one of them, but how does that make them human when apparently the Iraqis are not? Again, an utterly shameless man. A piece from last week from American Greatness by Pedro Gonzalez. Conserving conservatism is conserving defeat. Well, Pedro is preaching to the choir here. You know my position on this. Conservatism should have packed it in or been wrapped up in 1991 when the Soviet Union was dissolved. It served no purpose after that. And the word itself, conservative, is a harmful word. Gonzalez begins, the first thing we have to accept about the culture wars that the Republican Party and the conservative movement have lost. As it is for a battered alcoholic with bottles clinking about his heels, the first step toward recovery is admitting we have a problem. Nowhere is this more evident than in the battle of the biological sexes, lost without a shot fired. Even before the gubernatorial candidacy of Bruce Caitlyn Jenner in California became official, rumors swirled that Trump's former campaign manager, Brad Parscale, would lend Jenner a hand. Sure enough, Parscale helped Jenner assemble a team which reportedly includes Trump's former pollster Tony Fabrizio and former White House communications aide Stephen Chung. Jenner's campaign's website is now live and accepting donations without so much as a single policy issue listed, not that it would matter. The new GOP appears much the same as the old GOP. Jenner will lose in California, but not before a pile of cash is incinerated in a distracting spectacle, and the GOP beclowns itself, graduating from Democrats are the real racists to chanting Democrats are the real transphobes, which appears to be the direction the conservative movement is traveling. According to Turning Point USA influencer Isabel Brown, the choice is between the public execution, that's a direct quotation, public execution of alphabet people and freedom, and conservatives are in the freedom business. We're often told by the media and political left that America is a terrible place for members of the pride community, she says. But the truth is, America is among the most progressive places on earth to be yourself. Brown rattles off a series of the most violent examples of discrimination, which she claims tend to occur in countries with big government dominion over society, like Iraq. Gonzalez comments, Iraq has many problems. Big government dominion is not one of them. In the United States, on the other hand, Congress generously provided $5.7 million in taxpayers' dollars to the National Institutes of Health for a study wherein children as young as 8 received puberty-suppressing cross-sex hormones that will render them permanently infertile. Such are the blessings of liberty. Nationally, Republicans like Arkansas Governor Asa Hutchinson and South Dakota Governor Kristi Noem have capitulated to the queer zeitgeist. Hutchinson vetoed a measure to ban castration for minors suffering from gender dysphoria, also known as gender-affirming therapy. Noem effectively killed a bill intended to restrict transgender participation in women's sports. Republicans and conservatives lost the culture war in part because they are afraid of their own shadow almost as much as they are scared of shadows to the right. Transgenderism seems to be the issue on which many on the right prefer to let loose their inner reactionary, which then further rationalizes petty tyranny on the left, warned J.J. McCullough, a columnist for the National Review Online. McCullough is, although I don't think noted in this story, a homosexual himself and a Canadian. In other words, McCullough thinks losing gracefully is preferable to a fight, a view often described as prudence, because calling it cowardness is too on the nose. But they also lost because they started fights by accepting left-wing premises on issues. I think it's worth offering a conservative defense of transgender rights, which ought to be a conservative issue, as Josh Galernter argued illustratively in National Review. Galernter wrote in defense of Republican Kentucky Governor Matt Bevin, who in 2016 promised to not use the state's newly won GOP majority to push through a bill restricting transgender bathroom use. Is there anyone you know in Kentucky who has trouble going to the bathroom? Bevin said dismissively. The last thing we need is more government rules. I'm cutting red tape, not creating it. Of course, the issue for the people who handed Bevin and the GOP victory isn't trouble going to the bathroom, but the concern that individuals experiencing what was until recently considered mental illness will share a bathroom with their children. 1 year after Bevin's quip, a young girl allegedly was sexually assaulted in an Atlanta school by a boy who identifies as a girl and thus was allowed to follow her into the bathroom. An investigation revealed the school district's non-response to the sexual assault complaints of the girl's mother and others, and, quote, it's actively misleading communications with other alarmed parents in the entire community, unquote. Jane Robbins reported in The Federalist. Policies founded on truth cannot be maintained in an open and honest environment, Robbins adds, and Gonzalez comments she is right. No one should suffer abuse, but rather than exalting the virtues of our transgender culture, the right should reject the normalization of what is essentially a pathology connected to staggering suicide rates. A long-term study shows this to be the case, even with treatment in trans-friendly Sweden. Quote, persons with transsexualism after sex reassignment have considerably higher risks for mortality, suicidal behavior, and psychiatric morbidity than the general population. Our findings suggest that sex reassignment, although alleviating gender dysphoria, may not suffice as treatment for transsexualism and should inspire improved psychiatric and somatic care after sex reassignment for this patient group, unquote. In other words, shredding the genitals of people with a mental illness and pumping them with cross-sex hormones may not be the best way to help. But it is the easy way because it comes without the social stigma of sounding regressive. Sounding regressive. As I say, I want politicians to be asked this question over and over again by as many people as possible. Why are you in favor of the sexual mutilation of children? They don't want to answer that question. Oh, they'll use words like gender affirming. No, what you're talking about is the sexual mutilation of children. Yes, I see Gonzalez read the same essay that I did. French author Michel Houellebecq said the honor of a civilization is not exactly nothing. And this was to do with the French adoption of euthanasia or physician-assisted murder. Of course, Canada's so-called conservatives are all in favor of euthanasia, a physician-assisted suicide. When the Supreme Court decided to legalize it, there wasn't a peep out of Stephen Harper or Jason Kenney or any of these so-called conservatives. Again, they're the conservatives. They can call themselves conservatives if they want. The term is meaningless and harmful. Gonzalez says a civilization that legalizes the sterilization and mutilation of its children has done worse than legalizing euthanasia because it lies to itself about the truth. It has put itself on a path towards suicide by robbing its sons and daughters of the ability to procreate, even as birth rates plummet. It has chosen to die a humiliating death. But transgenderism is only the latest failure of conservatism in the GOP, which has surrendered on everything, including immigration, criminal justice, and reparations, even as it continues to welcome the influence of progressive corporations to their states, influence that in time will reduce red states to a shade of purple and then blue. Further, conservative complaints that a new order can't be legislated or that anyone to their right isn't against them so much as the times betray a poverty of vision. Today, 1 in 6 adults born between 1997 and 2002 identify as something other than heterosexual. This did not happen organically. It was manufactured by the sheer force of will and tenacity of the left and made possible by conservative fecklessness. There is therefore no reason to be conservative, because to be conservative in America today is to preserve an order that has lost its legitimacy, and the right thing is not to conserve, but destroy it and institute something else. The Republican Party as it stands is and will continue to be an obstacle to the cause. I'm going to talk a little about K-pop or Korean pop. And I'm not going to talk about it so much from the musical point of view, but from a, I suppose you could say, cultural or societal point of view, because I find it to be a fascinating phenomenon that I suppose I first became aware of this, along with most people, around the time of Gangnam Style, which was the first big K-pop hit in the West. And then K-pop got bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger. And then it started getting involved in politics, or that is to say, many of its followers started to get involved in politics. And I started seeing all these pictures of K-pop bands. They're typically bands of boy bands or girl bands. And I noticed something strange about them, the uncanny valley. that the women look like girls, and the boys. Well, sorry, I messed it up. The boys look like girls, and the girls don't look human. They're freakish looking. They're freakish looking because of their dyed hair, their extreme effeminacy of the boy bands, and for the fact that many of them are required to get rhinoplasty, nose jobs, and whatever the technical term is for having your eyelids fixed so you don't look Asian anymore. But, boy bands have been around for a while, obviously, that they reached their peak roughly around the year 2000. And there was a formula for them. And the formula was described in a satirical song written on Channel 4's Star Stories, their episode on Simon Cowell. And it was a parody of the Irish boy band Westlife. And here's some lyrics from it. We're the perfect boy band. There's one each for the moms. I'm the fat one. Then they sing this, down the line. I'm the fat one. I'm the thin one. I'm the one losing me hair. I'm the cute one. I'm the secretly gay one about who no one cares. Yes, something for everybody. But I'm not seeing very much differentiation amongst in the boy bands or the girl bands. They all seem to be of a type. With boy bands, I'm looking at a picture of BTS here. And, there's one blonde here who, again, this just uncanny valley is off the charts. And there's another one here who, okay, that's a boy, because you're telling me that's a boy. This very much does not look like a boy. And I'm not just talking about, dressing or whatever, or color of hair. I'm talking about facial expressions here, facial means that, I guess there's an old joke from The Simpsons from the early years, when they were funny about Lisa Simpson reading a magazine called Non-Threatening Boys. Well, they're all pretty much non-threatening boys. And of course, the so-called variety that I spoke of in Western boy bands was largely fake too. These were pretty much all non-threatening boys, and it was designed this way. But there's not even an attempt to show, maybe some of them aren't really so non-threatening. There is so the music is quite well done, actually, but it's a pastiche. It's a relentless synthesis of various recent trends in pop music. And it is disposable. But of course, it is meant to be disposable, just as the bands themselves are disposable. No one will be listening to BTS in, 5-10 years time. I can pretty much guarantee that. And someone from that band could make a name for himself. If this has happened, but it is really not supposed to happen, because these are corporate identities. They're corporate identities created by corporations. They are owned by corporations. They sign what are known as slave contracts, which used to be in Korea 13 years before even the Korean authorities decided that this was excessive. This was reduced to a period of 7 years. These people are selected. These young people are selected, much as communist governments used to select future chess players or gymnasts at a young age, and then they are drilled in various disciplines for up to 10 years. And it's been estimated that the cost of training could be as high as $3 million. Now, a great many of these bands, these Korean idol bands, they have to pay back the money for their training, which is absolutely astonishing to me, because even the biggest bands, hardly the ones who have platinum records in America, who sell out the Rose Bowl, they are not earning very much money at all. Does $42,000 a year sound like very much money to you for being in one of the biggest bands in the world? And if they stand out in some way, well, they can be sacked. There's been some efforts in Korea to protect these slaves, but typically they are terrified of management. And there are longstanding rumors that the girls are essentially sex slaves for their managers and other prominent men in Korea. But now, okay, so you look at the music that they make, and it's been pointed out many times that it is non-threatening, that it tends to be largely cheery. It is not skanky like like Britney Spears or Christina Aguilera or the amusingly named Ariana Grande and the like. It's not like that. It's wholesome. Except watching the video for a big hit by the girl band called AOA, Miniskirt. That's not very wholesome at all. This is very close to open pedophilia. Very, very close indeed. Okay, so who is going to listen to this kind of music? Well, obviously young people, particularly girls, pubescent, barely pubescent girls or prepubescent girls. But it would appear that the K-pop bands have enormous number of adult fans. And there are several reasons. Oh, before I go into that, I should say, look, the idea of people in boy bands or girl bands being slaves, it's really not that much different from what Simon Cowell does. You go on one of his talent shows and you're signed to his company, which is called Psycho for Simon Cowell. Psycho. Get it? And you don't make very much money, even if you have hits. And God forbid that one of your songs should not get into the top 10 or the top 5, because you will be fired. If you are part of Simon Cowell's stable, you are to be milked until you are run out of milk. It's that simple. It's a little crueler in Korea, but as I say, in the pop world, post, Pop Idol, X Factor, Britain's Got Talent, American Idol, etc. It's gone back to the 1950s, where there's just a bunch of disposable boys named Bobby or Jimmy or something like that. Strangely enough, it's the girls that are raunchy and it's the boys that are effeminate. I'm sure that there's a well-known reason for that as well. But we find out that you may have seen this phenomenon, which just, I could hardly believe it, that after George Floyd died, you'd go to Twitter and K-pop was everywhere. Now, how was it everywhere and why was it everywhere? Well, because K-pop fans were intervening on the internet to make a political point. And the political point was that Black Lives Matter and that white lives do not matter. Really? Okay. That's what's actually happened. And you get these gang-ups, this organized bombing of the internet by K-pop fans on a regular basis because they believe themselves to be woke, progressive. Here's a story from the LA Times, June 4th of last year by Victoria Kim. Katja Grossman couldn't march in the U.S. protests against police violence and racism, But with a few keystrokes, she raised a six-figure sum for the cause by tapping into a massive, impassioned international platform at her fingertips, K-pop fandom, that a chronically ill college senior from a small town in Hudson Valley, New York, could instantly connect to the global outrage over the death of George Floyd is a testament to the power and allure of South Korean boy bands and their legions of social media clever fans. The 21-year-old sat on her bed and typed out a challenge to the 3,000 followers on her fan account for boy band BTS. You buy 7 copies of the same album and you say you're poor. You can donate $1. She wrote, linking to an online fundraising page for a young woman's political action group in Minnesota. She listed what she thought was a moonshot goal, $1,000. As of Thursday, she had raised $150,000. Dominating on social media is at the heart of the avid worldwide fandom of Korean pop music. Fans have gained notoriety over the years for carpet bombing Twitter timelines and Instagram feeds in support of stars or groups they like, promoting new songs or albums the minute they're released, or circulating videos and photos of their faves. They've been known to strategically stream YouTube videos for hours on end, or rain abuse on anyone making negative comments about groups they support. In recent days, many of them have unleashed their online prowess towards supporting BLM protests, crashing police tip lines, circulating petitions and fundraising pages, amplifying activist messages. They took over hashtags, including White Lives Matter, to drown out those opposing the protests. We are known for our antics, said Grossman, who was turned on to K-pop about a year ago through the group Blackpink and later became a devout BTS fan. We dedicate to things. It's very obsessive, our support or non-support of things. Yes, Anonymous had reported on Twitter, anonymous K-pop divisions are currently taking down police streams across the United States. Operations to spam police apps with fan cams to protect protester identities are underway. We stand the resistance. Hashtags I can't breathe. Hashtag George Floyd. Hashtag Trump dictatorship. Grossman was among the K-pop fans who responded to requests from the Dallas Police Department for videos of illegal activity from the protests by sending in K-pop videos instead, causing the department's app to crash. I hope one day this woman never has to call 911 with a police emergency or a medical emergency to find out this service has been brought down by K-pop fans standing it with spam. The hacker activist group Anonymous took note, writing on Twitter, K-pop armies have now been weaponized against the state. Now, there is no political content whatsoever to K-pop songs. It's mostly about, love, which is kid stuff, as Peter Blagvad pointed out. But I suppose even people who listen to vapid music must be progressives now. The LA Times continues, while music has helped propel social movements throughout history, the carefully crafted commercialized world of K-pop has largely steered clear of political and social issues in the interest of preserving mass appeal and even avoiding a whiff of scandal. Groomed, interesting word to use, from a young age for stardom by agencies, stars rarely voice political opinions, and when they do, they've occasionally met with backlash from fans or repercussions from music labels. That hasn't stopped fans, many of whom are Gen Z digital natives, perhaps experiencing their first social awakening, from emerging as a force to be reckoned with in the latest conversations over race and justice in the U.S. I'm looking at a picture of BTS appearing at the Rose Bowl, and from the faces that I can see, this crowd appears to be about 90% female. We're a huge audience, says 19-year-old Louisiane Mamavuli, a BTS fan based in London, who said she felt compelled to speak up, donate to bail funds, and support protests in the U.S. after watching videos from fellow Black BTS fans protesting in American streets. Ji-young Lee, a 49-year-old South Korean philosophy professor and BTS fan, said the global network of fans had in recent years tapped their social media organizing skills to get messages out about the pro-democracy protests in Hong Kong and crackdowns on student protests in Bangladesh in 2018. This week, she called on K-pop fans in South Korea to back fellow fans in the U.S. noting that South Korea has experience with large-scale protests against authoritarianism. We know so well the scenes of protest engulfed in rage and fear, she wrote in Korean on Twitter, urging South Korean fans to support BLM. What BLM has done, and the other Korean idol groups have done, is something, it's quite advanced, because obviously popular music has been close to fandom from the very beginning, but K-pop has added another layer to it. That one of the delusions of fandom is that you enjoy a personal relationship with whoever music that you worship. Of course, we're not talking about music being worshipped now. We're talking about brands being worshipped. There's always been a brand component, to popular music, but it's now become supreme. But K-pop has managed to persuade the fans themselves that they enjoy a special connection to each other. Now, of course, there have always been fan clubs, but fan clubs were typically a small affair. K-pop has resulted in a situation where all over the world, people believe that their closest friends, I suppose even closer than their brothers and sisters, closer than their children perhaps, are other K-pop fans, which is really a remarkable achievement. And you see how virtual affection has become. It seems that we will go to any lengths now to avoid being friendly with actual people, because I suppose that's dangerous in all sorts of ways. So you can listen to vapid pop music, and you can be an obsessive fan of various bands, who, by the way, the members of which are completely irreplaceable. And it's amusing looking at several of these K-pop bands. Well, you had 7 members, 8 members, then 7, then 5, then 3. What's happening to all of the rest of them? As I read, the K-poppers, the boys in the K-pop bands, they have a particular problem, which the girls don't have, is that military service is mandatory in South Korea, and it must be done at the latest by the age of 28. So it gets put off for a long time. But the fear is that if they leave to go into the army at 28, they will be finished, washed up. Everyone will have forgotten about them. Now, Elvis Presley famously was in the army, but his record company RCA recorded a whole bunch of stuff, which was released while he was serving in West Germany. That sort of thing can't be done nowadays, because record production is so very down to the minute. Oh, there's been a slight shift in what makes a hit record now. So every record has got to sound like that. Now, these changes are really not profound at all. But nowadays, you disappear for 2 years, and it's like 2 years was an eternity ago. But as, I don't know, Akino Kure was noting the other day that radio stations appear to have stopped playing new music. Again, perhaps because it all sounds the same. There have been a number of stories covering the sexual scandals of K-pop, and there was a particularly horrifying one in Bloomberg Business Week by Matthew Campbell and So-hee Kim, which appeared in, when did this appear? Well, it doesn't matter, actually. The layout of this story makes it hard to figure out. But yes, sex trafficking, date rape, spy camera recordings, and bribery, as well as drug use. I suppose one of the problems is that these girls and boys, well, the girls more than the boys, are supposed to be perfect in every regard, and young people are not perfect. So information about their indiscretions is used well to blackmail them. and to extract sexual favors from them, and just to make sure that they never step out of line again. Perhaps, not complaining that they are making billions of dollars for South Korean companies and are being paid a pittance. Okay, I'm going to take a final look at the chat. Yako Raipala says, young white American men fought wars abroad so that America could fill the world with woke regimes that center their ideology around hating the white American man. Humans are status imitating machines, says Yako Raipala. Indeed they are. Whatever the most powerful people do becomes high status. Elite wokeness will eventually destroy American power, but as long as it lasts, it's the elite signifier. Respectable commentating name says it's a near century-old grudge that the American working class didn't want to finish the revolution and was satisfied with improved living and working conditions and wages. I think there's a lot to that, because when you look at the labor turmoil in America in the late 19th century, the famous strikes against Andrew Carnegie and the like, the Pinkertons being brought in, the violence, the murder, and then you see the rise of the labor unions. And I'm thinking of AFL-CIO, not the IWW, the Wobblies, that the working class was bought off by high wages. Oh, boo. Yes, imagine those terrible days when a man working on an assembly line could have 5 children and own his house outright and own his car outright and maybe have a boat and take a family vacation every year. Remember those terrible days? China makes the decisions for the West now with their network of influence, says Brandon Smith. Okay, I think I'm going to wrap it up here. I'll be back on the air tomorrow at 4 p.m. Pacific, 7 p.m. Eastern. Thank you all for tuning in. If you like the show or any part of it, I would appreciate it if you would click on the like button and subscribe to my YouTube channel if you have not done so already. Coming up on Theater Thursday on May the 6th, that's this Thursday, we have Doug Liman's 1999 film Go, which, as previously mentioned, is hilariously funny with lots of great music in it. On the book club this week, Tom Holland's book, Dynasty, which is the successor to his book, Rubicon. It is about the fall of the House of Caesar. And on Music Monday next week, I'm going to be talking about a cult figure. I was into him at the beginning. Well, not at the beginning. I was into him from 1974 when Capitol Records brought out his first 2 records, which had been completely ignored in North America. I don't even know even released, because Pink Floyd blew up, and then people asked, who is this fellow Syd Barrett? He was arguably the founder of Pink Floyd. He was the lead guitarist. He sang the songs, and he wrote the songs. So I'm going to be talking about Syd Barrett next Monday. So if you would like to make a donation to this live stream, which I could really use at this time because of the uncertainty of my living situation, my PayPal account is linked to Kevin_Grace@hotmail.com. Once again, Kevin_Grace@hotmail.com. If you're in Canada, donations to this live stream can be made directly via interact@kevingrace@shaw.ca. And as always, I leave you with this. In these days of social atomization and civilizational collapse, I do dearly wish that you, my dear viewers and listeners, manage to forge a genuine human connection in order to ease the burden. Good night.